Hello, dear colleagues, distinguished guests. I'm very happy to be the chair of, I'm very honored to be here among you to introduce this roundtable. But first of all, I would like to give the floor to Honorable Sinkyung Pempa Tsering. So Pempa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator Gatolin. Today morning we had a very interesting and emotional session. In fact, I became quite emotional after Speaker Pelosi spoke about her relationship with Tibet over the last 35 years. She has been very, very supportive. Her support has been very consistent. And as Richard Gay said, it's coming from the heart. And Richard also has been very much involved. Even when I was the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama in Washington, D.C., he always used to come up to lobby with us, both in the House and the Senate. And after I assumed the role of the Sikyong also, he was always there. During my last visit in April, he was also with us, working with us along shoulder to shoulder at the Hill. And Damon Wilson's speech. And just for your information, I was very impressed by my speaker's speech also, Kembo Sanam Tembe, because we worked together and he studied English on his own. Yeah, so that was very impressive. So as we were designing the program, along with the Speaker and Deputy Speaker of the House, this time round, we decided not to focus on the issues inside Tibet because that's mostly in the background notes that has been prepared for you. Instead, we decided to look at how we can keep the action moving in terms of the session that we had already this morning when Jim McGovern spoke on the initiatives taken by the United States government and how other like-minded countries can adopt similar actions in their parliaments. This is, for us, a very important topic, and considering the Ukraine situation and the evolving dynamism in world politics, it does make a lot of sense to see how the world community looks at China under the new perspectives. And it is going to be very important for us to watch out in the next few months as to how things evolve and China's role in this whole dynamism of global politics and what new global order might shape up and what opportunities might be there for Tibet or Uyghurs and Mongolians and Hong Kongers and even our friends in Taiwan. So we will have to watch the developments very closely and see how we can leverage our issues with the new developments. And now, since we finished that session already with Jim McGovern's presentation this morning and the very active involvement by other parliamentarians, even I was very much moved and encouraged to see that many other parliamentarians are looking at ways to see how things can be moved in terms of legislation or resolution in their respective parliaments. And this is something that we have to keep it going. We can't just have one conference and then wait for the next conference to happen. This has to be a continuous involvement of parliaments to parliaments relationship and how best practices can be shared and how we can network together, because the one very reason for having this World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet is also to create, as our speaker mentioned this morning, to create a common platform for all those who are supportive of on resolving the Sino-Tibet conflict to come together. So that session we finished, and I'm quite happy with the involvement of other honorable members of parliament from different countries in expressing their interest in how they can leverage and take the movement forward in their national parliaments. And in this convention, we also decided to keep another session on the changing narratives on Tibet. The fact is, China's propaganda is so strong and pervasive, and not many people in this world have the time to read Tibet's history. So to gain leverage for the middle way approach, for the world to understand that Tibet was an independent country, and that His Holiness the Dalai Lama decided to step down from independence to middle way. Because of China's propaganda, many people believe that Tibet has been a part of China since time immemorial, as China says today. But unfortunately, that is not the truth. And tomorrow morning, as Jim mentioned, the Congressional Executive Commission on China for the first time will hold a hearing in the Congress with the testimonies of researchers and historians who are present, two of whom are present here. Michael van Walt van Praag, who has been associated with the Tibetans for a very, very long time, I think since 1973 when he was a little boy. And then after he finished his international law, he has been associated with us over the years, and with all those collective experience, he has worked with many scholars, over 70, 80 scholars from so many different countries in Asia, and concludes that Tibet has never been considered part of China, whether it is to do with the Mongolian order or the Ming order or the Manchu order, or as per international law today. And then we also have Professor Lau with us here from San Diego, who has done, he has always faced this question as to whether Tibet is part of China or not. And after his retirement, he spent a lot more time looking at the historical documents. Particularly, he wanted to start from the Manchus because his thinking is that he's getting old, and he wanted to cover the latest part of the years from 1644 to 1911. And his book is being translated. It's almost ready for publication. And he has referred to the Manchu imperial Chinese records that establishes the fact that Tibet has never been considered part of the Manchu Empire. And going back to Ming also, we hardly had much relationship with the Mings and the Yuans. We had relations with the Yuans much before the Mongols invaded China. So with those historical perspectives in mind, His Holiness was asked by the Chinese as a precondition to say that Tibet is part of China since time immemorial, or since antiquity. But His Holiness is a Buddhist monk, and as Richard Gere was saying this morning, that he points at his tongue and says, "This tongue never lies." So he cannot lie. So he cannot say that Tibet was part of China. Therefore, His Holiness came with a very wise answer to the Chinese, saying that I'm not a historian. Let us leave history to historians. What is more important for us is the future of the Tibetan people. Therefore, now you have historians establishing the fact that Tibet was never part of China. And to counter, now the next question is, why is China asking the international community to say that Tibet is part of PRC? That is because China knows that they lack legitimacy over Tibet. And they are trying to get this legitimacy from the international community. But unfortunately, the international community will not be able to give legitimacy of China over Tibet. The only people who can give legitimacy to China are the Tibetan people, or His Holiness the Dalai Lama, not the international community. Unfortunately, when China insists on nations to say that Tibet is part of PRC, nations also recite that like a mantra, saying that Tibet is part of PRC. And when you say that, you are going against international law, for one. And for another, when you keep repeating that statement, it means more like, you do whatever you want to do in Tibet, we will not interfere. That's why China also keeps using this term, saying that Tibet is a domestic issue or a national issue, and that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is trying to internationalize it. But on the other hand, nations will also say that they support negotiation between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government, or representatives of His Holiness Dalai Lama, or envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or the CDA leadership with the Chinese government. We feel these are contradicting each other. Therefore, it is very important to talk about the status of historical Tibet, which the US has taken the initiative in the form of a hearing. And I hope and I believe that the members present here will take the message back to their countries that Tibet historically was never part of China. And the reason why His Holiness decided to go for autonomy instead of independence was taking the reality of the situation inside Tibet, considering that under President Xi today, Xi's policies and programs are all aimed at the eradication of the identity of the nationalities, whether it's the Tibetans or the Uyghurs or the Mongols. So Chinese have started teaching Mandarin from Montessori to the Tibetan students. They have started, according to one report by the Tibet Action Institute, about 78% of the Tibetan children are in what is termed as colonial boarding schools, separating them, separating the children from their families, keeping them away from their way of life. And if Chinese are really adamant about implementing these policies in another 15, 20 years down the line, we may not have that many Tibetans in Tibet who will speak the Tibetan language. And that will be very, very detrimental for the whole cause and for the existence. This is an existential problem for the Tibetans. So with these two objectives, the speaker and the deputy speaker, and we decided to design this program, not only to talk about the immediate and the urgent problems that we face inside Tibet, but look at how we can work together and how do we have to change the narrative to provide leverage for the middle way approach, so that Chinese will have to consider coming to the negotiating table. The reason why I said these two statements of, on the one hand, saying Tibet is part of PRC, and on the other hand, saying that they support negotiation, are contradictory, and that does not help leverage, because the middle way approach, because Chinese rule Tibet with an iron grip inside Tibet. And when there's no international community to caution them as to what is happening inside Tibet, then there's no reason for China to come on the negotiating table. So we now realize that this is their Achilles heel. of China. The question that concerns the legitimacy of China over Tibet is China's weakness, and that is where we need to strike. That is why we feel it's important to change the narrative on Tibet. Then there are also other issues in this program talking about Tibet's environment, which is not only important to the Tibetans, but the whole region and maybe for the whole world, because we call ourselves the land, heavenly abode, land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. Then by 1906, I remember one American author having termed one of his chapters as roof of the world. And since then, the Western world started calling Tibet the roof of the world because of its altitude of more than 12,000 feet average altitude of Tibet. And then Asians call Tibet as the source of Asian rivers, because the major rivers that originate from Tibet goes into India, Pakistan, into India, Bangladesh, then into Burma, into Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. And the two major rivers in China also originate from Tibet. So there are serious issues about water security in the years to come. We have been saying that we are political refugees today, but there may be many more environmental refugees in the future. It's estimated that about 1.8 billion people, because these are the most densely populated areas in the world, some estimate that 1.8 million people in this world either directly or indirectly depend on a river that originates from Tibet. So this is of importance not only to the Tibetans, but the whole neighboring downstream countries. Right now, the downstream countries are not in a position to stand up to China, but if it comes to that, when it comes to their livelihood, I'm sure they will, but let's hope that it's not too late, because China does not share any hydrological data with any of the downstream countries. They have built at least 32 dams on the Mekong even before it reaches the next country. There are major programs on the Brahmaputra at the Bend where they are talking about a dam twice the size of the Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest in the world. And the Himalayas are a seismic zone, very prone to earthquakes. Just recently we had another earthquake in Tibet. So you can imagine the implication of Tibet's fragile environment over the whole region. Then in this convention, we also have our friends from Uyghur. Dolkun Isa is here. We have had a very long relationship. Uyghurs are our neighbors, our friends. I always ask our international friends not to use the word Xinjiang also. Xinjiang is the word given by China to the Uyghur people. It's better to call them Uyghur people or East Turkestanis, because for Tibet they say Xizang. I was told that Chinese government tried to use Xizang for about 3 weeks, and then they realized that nobody understands what Xizang is. So they went back to Tibet. So I think if the international community does not use the words that China uses, even when you look at the Google map, if I look at the Google map, I won't be able to identify areas inside Tibet which are now Chinese names. So we have to desist. But these are also part of the signification of Tibet and other national regions inside China, even though these are small matters, but it does matter a lot in terms of avoiding or deflecting China's signification of all the nationalities in Tibet and in China. And during this session, we also have we will have friends from Hong Kong and maybe also Mongolia, where we will discuss about finding common grounds. Even though our issues are different, people are different, but we face the same opponent. and how do we galvanize our efforts together to face the common opponent. And I think that will be one very interesting session where we hope that there could be some concrete proposals for us to pursue into the future to face common challenges. So with these remarks, I also want to specifically point out Speaker Pelosi's remarks this morning about His Holiness reincarnation, which should be in the declaration of this World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet, that the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama will lie only with His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people, not the Chinese government. Just before conclude, I want to recognize the presence of my old friend, Senator Dini No, because he is the one parliamentarian who has never missed any of the World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet since 1994. The first World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet was held in 1994, and he was there from that time onwards to the second Parliamentarians Convention in Lithuania in 1995, and the third Parliamentarians Convention in Washington, D.C. in 1997. And then there was a long gap, and I was personally involved in organizing the fourth World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet in Scotland in 2006. And by the next convention, I was already the Speaker of the Parliament in 2009, when we had the fifth World Parliamentarians Convention in Rome. And the sixth was with Senator Dini No in Ottawa. He hosted the World Parliamentarians Convention in Ottawa in 2012. And then there was a long gap of 7 years till it was held in Latvia in 2019. And now we are here after 25 years in Washington, D.C. for the 8th World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet. So I really appreciate the presence of all of you, some of you whom you have traveled for 26 hours to reach here. And that itself shows your concern for the cause of Tibet and the importance of resolving the Sino-Tibet conflict. As Michael would, I'm sure, repeat in his presentation tomorrow, that we don't want to trivialize the conflict by calling it the Tibet issue. We would rather like to call it the Sino-Tibet conflict to raise the level of the nature of the cause. So we have to be, I would urge you to be more careful about the semantics also, because semantics also matter a lot when it comes to political issues. So thank you very much again for your presence. I won't be speaking anymore till the end of this conference is over. But I would like to seek very dynamic involvement from every one of you. And when you go back to your countries, I hope you will go back with more concrete ideas about what you need to do in your own national parliaments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Honorable Sikyong. So just for launching this roundtable entitled Democracy, Relevance and Challenge in Today's World, we will launch the screening of a 30 minutes long video on called Democracy, the Gift of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama to Tibet. And after that, we'll have the speech of our guests, especially some various parliamentarians from country. But first, everybody will look the screen here, because if you come here at the table, you can see it. Okay. Thank you so much. So if we can launch the projection, the screening, it's nice.
신의 줘야지 마도 내대 지금 그게 간다 이제나 야름 치야 못은 지금 첩시 구치인데 남아 내잖아 지금 수부지 하대로 소리 차 일단 내봐도 주주당 걸 주주당 뒤에 안 들리는 소리도 자 드디어 이제 드디어 타네 매만 그 감을 챘는 여자에 따라라 디커도 때딱 룩니기 우치리사 취시니 우치리사 때다 참샤샤나 시지 되는 타네 맞아 나도 남주 손도 살아 그거야 손도 줘서 손도 죽을 때 손도 개량하는 절이 있어도 와 어디 되는 시체니 경험하네 뭐 취시니 우치체니 또 로시들 하서 심어데 다 개개만에 잠샤 정말 시지가
His Holiness made it clear that although he was relieving himself from any direct political involvement as relating to the laws and legislation of the Tibetan government in exile, as the Dalai Lama, he would continue to serve as an active spokesperson for the Tibetan cause.
강제배 유비차대요. 강제뭐 쌓여 주 좋은 남, 비밀 좋은 남자 용서로다 별집에 더다게 게 틀려요. 그래서 마차샤네 별 좋은 남자인데 미 재직 차대요. 도매 암도 유는 영배 별시 차대요. 강제로 차대요. 나 뭐시부터 게데 여봐.
constitution 좀 쳐. 네 배도 배민관 쇼다. 네 배민 뭐도 지진 sense. 텐데니 마인데 배나마죠. 고든 기반하기 드럼미해봐. 대형 로직이 쇼라브제. 리용리 배민근데 제도 바인데 내가 저 짜팅이 된제 동빈 놀러라. 아니 된제 숨치 상주슈에 된제 동보데 배미데데 somshye yerjedan chedo riyo rineji sonsho tabedan peki zaden dotojin chen ane bemedan bemi jinzu ki lede konchi tola kalo longden dan kuja nonjo ne tenze nimba de concession ge mu chok gyogan namzi kodon ane ngoti namge sonde nam hila peki zaden dotojin chen be ane lede keji tola bemi jinzu don ne bemi mongi chedo 네 주조도 가샤게 공비 제기라 공장 농조 된저 손바데 뱀미 진조당 뱀미모기 체도 자시 우친 넘바 네 다노 이게 네 미나카 양체 고들당 네 가샤게 공주 시베 고접 된제 당 메세 고접 넘나 공장을 좀 초게 고접 진세네 자주 된저시네 아주 된저 수데 산주 휴토바쇼레 네 아주 천년도 규칙 신당과 비기 technique 잡으면 잔지 라트르히르 근데 constitution 좀 초기다 그거 전제 도마를 지네 모두 소전나 인게 먼저 변매 양지 모두 터던다 이게 우리가 야마라를 통해 모두 제토고야 돼 개체 못 차대야.
The 14th Tibetan Parliament in exile decided to form a charter review committee. Consequently, the second Tibetan National General Meeting was convened from 21st to 24th May 2011. The meeting discussed the amendment of His Holiness's political authority in the Charter and decided to plea His Holiness to at least continue holding political authority in a ceremonial capacity. The 14th Tibetan Parliament in exile convened an additional parliament session to make the 25th Charter Amendment to transfer all political authorities of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the leaders directly elected by the Tibetan people and the democratically elected leadership. On 29th May, His Holiness the Dalai Lama signed the document formally transferring his temporal authority to the democratically elected leaders. The Parliament approved the change of name Tibetan Government in Exile to Central Tibetan Administration and the motto on the official emblem Gande Poda Chole Namgel to Demba Ni Number Gelgurjik. With the amendments in the Charter, Kalyan Tripa will approve and promulgate the bills and regulations passed by the Tibetan Parliament in exile. Likewise, the Kalyan Tripa will appoint not more than 7 Kalyans for his or her cabinet to be approved by the Parliament. Oath of office administered by His Holiness the Dalai Lama was to be commissioned by the Chief Justice Commissioner of the Tibetan Supreme Justice Commission. Convention of biannual parliamentary sessions and additional sessions summoned by His Holiness the Dalai Lama was to be summoned by the Tibetan Parliament in Exile. Similarly, as per the need, the Kashak, the Speaker, and the Deputy Speaker of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile may call a special general meeting of Tibetan public, which was previously done by His Holiness. The Chief Justice Commissioner, other two Justice Commissioners of the Tibetan Supreme Justice Commission, and heads of the autonomous bodies appointed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama was to be voted by the Tibetan Parliament in Exile. If the requisite quorum is not met, the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker can postpone the parliamentary session for more than 7 days, which was previously done in consultation with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The outcome of popular referendum initiated through the Central Tibetan Election Commission has to be signed and announced by the Sikyong, which was earlier done by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The 15th Tibetan Parliament in Exile amended the official title of Kalun Triba to Sikyong Political Leader, and the strength of the members of Parliament was increased to 45. Dr. Lobsang Sengye became the first Sikyong of the Central Tibetan Administration after the Charter Amendment on the 8th of August 2011, and served as the Sikyong for 2 consecutive terms from the year 2011 to 2016 and the year 2016 to 2021 for the 14th and the 15th Kashak. On 27th May 2021, Pemba Tsering, the current Sikyong of the Central Tibetan Administration, was sworn in as the Sikyong of the 16th Kashak by the Tibetan Supreme Justice Commissioner. The transfer of all political authorities of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the leaders directly elected by the Tibetan people vests in them the competence to represent all Tibetans in Tibet and in exile, and to fulfill their public service. When the opportunity arises, the present government will dissolve and a new one will be formed with the participation of Tibetans from both inside and outside Tibet.
So thank you. I first would like to warmly congratulate the author of this very didactic video. For those who are not Tibetan, we are only a few to know well this institution. Once again, I must quote my friend Concilio Di Nino, because we had the opportunity many times to be observers, official observers for this election. And I must underline this initiative taken by the Kashak, the fact that foreign, I would say, parliamentarians come at each election to observe and at the end to give advice to improve your institution, because democratic institution is not definitively written. We have to make them get some progress. That's the same thing in all the country, even in consolidated democracy as Great Britain. It's different, but in France we have many changes of inside the constitution to adapt to new situation. And that's exactly the topic of the coming debate. Democracy is something wonderful. We can quote sometimes the ironical sentence pronounced by Winston Churchill in November 1947, when he say, democracy is the worst form of regime, but it's except all the other form of regime we've tested by the time to time. And so it's very interesting to know that democracy has some rules, but these rules must move, must adapt. And in the current society, in the international situation in which we are, with increasingly, I would say, brutality from China, brutality from Russian Federation, brutality from other authoritarian countries, it's very important to reinforce the democracy and also to assume that we have some challenge every time, every day, even if we feel nice and happy in our society, with the war of information, the use of social network to disrupt the democracy, to disrupt the democratic debate. We hold new democracy as Tibetan on exile democracy, or old democracy as the United States democracy or the British or the French democracy. We have to fight that. And so now I would like to give the floor to all the colleagues invited. And first of all, I would like to have the remarks from Senator Janet Rice from Australia. She belongs to the Green Party, and Australia is a very interesting country because they are facing a challenge in front of China today, and so it's very important to hear her. So the floor is yours, Janet.
Thank you, Senator Gettelang, and thank you everyone, and particularly the Tibetan community, for having me here today as part of this conference. It's a great privilege. I wanted to actually start by acknowledging that where we are today, the Washington area, was originally home to more than a dozen Native American tribal nations. And so today, we are meeting today on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank or Anacostan peoples, and the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples lived nearby. And so I want to acknowledge the First Nations peoples on whose sovereign lands we are on that we meet today. And I want to honour their elders, past and present, and all First Nations peoples, including those with us today. And I think it's important to do that because in putting Tibet into the context of working for rights and human rights right across the world. And for me, I see the campaign for the rights of the people of Tibet as part of worldwide campaigns for justice, for sovereignty, and for protection of country of occupied and First Nations peoples. And basically because we are here today because we know that it is wrong that people's rights have been taken away because of past or ongoing wars of colonisation, where we've had colonial powers who have come in, have invaded and trampled over people's rights, their freedoms and the resources of other peoples. And they are continuing to discriminate against, to persecute and to destroy the culture of Indigenous peoples and the occupied peoples. And whether this occurred over 300 years ago, as in the case of the United States, 200 years ago, as in the case of my country, Australia, and over 60 years ago in the case of the Chinese occupation of Tibet. And we all know that this is wrong and that as a world we can't just say, oh well, that's happened, move on, things have changed now, we'll just accept this new status quo. We have to take action. And in the US and Australia, where we had invasion, occupation, we've got ongoing discrimination, at least now we have First Nations peoples who are part of democratic systems of governance, where their support for their rights is growing, and even if it's too little and too slow. But we know that if they get sufficient support amongst, in my case in Australia, amongst the Australian community, eventually things are going to improve and there are going to be more rights and more, we'll have treaties, we will have justice for our First Nations peoples. But in Tibet, people haven't got that luxury. I mean, if they speak out about their oppression by the Chinese government, or the very fact that they are under occupation, as we've heard with the whole status of Tibet, just acknowledging that Tibet is not part of the People's Republic of China, that Tibet is a country that is still under occupation, they acknowledge, if they want to even say that, they are further persecuted. And they can't rely on a strategy of seeking the support of the Chinese population in the hope that maybe one day things might change, because, you know, we know that the Chinese population, the propaganda from the Chinese government is that they're not going to get support from that. And in any case, the Chinese population, they don't get to vote for change, even if they wanted to. So, bringing this back to the challenges for democracy and the reasons why democracy is so important, and, you know, even though it's the best form of government, even though it's the worst form of government except for all the others, because fundamental to a well-functioning democracy is the people having that power and having a say, and that means that the people as a whole have agency and can take action to achieve outcomes in their interest or the interests of people that they're advocating for. And if they are being governed, by people who are not acting in the interests, then they can vote them out and elect other people instead. And so my and the Greens' approach to international relations is that our work should be based on working for human rights in the context of our 4 pillars of democracy, of sustainability, of justice, and of peace and non-violence. And they are the 4 pillars of the Greens from across the world. So it's no surprise with that commitment that I'm here with you today. And most abuses of human rights, and certainly what is happening in Tibet, is because we've got very powerful people in the Chinese government who they like their power, they want to hold on to their power, and they are benefiting from the exploitation of people and land and resources. And so the Tibetan people need the rest of us, the people of democratic states who can speak out to take action against Chinese government oppression. I wanted to also reflect upon the value of democracy, not just working for democracy in China and in Tibet, but in fact the Tibetan people will benefit from democracy prevailing in the many small states that are a very significant part of our United Nations. And they would be much better off if there were more democracies, so that these small states aren't vulnerable to being bought off by bribes and inducements to corrupt leaders to support China, which we know is what is happening in a lot of countries in the world. That you've got countries that are silent on the issue of Tibet and the abuse of human rights in China because they've been essentially bought off by the Chinese government. So if we had more democracies across these small states around the world, then the United Nations would be in a position of taking a much more powerful stand on China. And we also know that a really important step in justice for the people of Tibet is for countries that have been involved in colonisation to acknowledge and make amends for that colonisation that has led to these failed states, and for our rich Western countries to better resource peace building and well-being in these countries. And the Tibetan people need Western democracies to recognise and make amends for their own complicity in the colonialism and the oppression of First Nations peoples, so that we can't be labelled as hypocrites by China. And certainly for Australia, where we have basically turned a blind eye to our very dark, violent history of the oppression of our First Nations peoples, we are very open to be called hypocrites by China that say essentially, well, you did the same to the First Nations peoples of Australia, so how can you criticise us for what we are doing in Tibet? And the Tibetan people, they need peoples and the governments of countries around the world to speak out and support Tibetans rather than big companies that are making money out of mining and exploitation of people and nature, who are basically, as we heard this morning, willing to turn a blind eye to the Chinese government's appalling human rights record, because as long as they can just keep on making money. And we saw that with the Beijing Winter Olympics, where we had companies that weren't willing to take a stand because they were making a lot of money out of it. So I'll just finish off just by having a bit of words of what we've been doing in Australia. We now have Magnitsky Legislation, which will enable us to be putting forward cases and hopefully getting targeted sanctions against Chinese government officials who have been responsible for human rights abuses in Tibet. And we have a lot of concern, and there's a lot of tension now in the Australia-Chinese relationship. But sadly, most of that has been because of concern about Chinese expansionism in our region rather than about human rights abuses. And so for me, in terms of action on Tibet and China in our government, bringing it back to the human rights abuses that are going on in China and in Tibet is of critical importance. I mean, we've got a parliamentary friendship group. We've got many MPs, and we've made many speeches and lots of good words spoken in many debates. But we need to do more, and I've been really inspired already by this conference and the work that we're doing here that's going to help us to work more effectively multilaterally and to really focus, I think, on developing legislation in parallel in countries across the world so that there will be actual consequences on the Chinese government of the human rights abuses and the oppression and the occupation of the Tibetan people. So, I mean, the challenges are huge, but in the words of His Holiness the Dalai Lama that I've actually got on a small scroll hanging up next to my desk at home, we must never give up. We just have to keep on working until we get that justice for the peoples of Tibet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. You've spoken of the new Magnitsky law in Australia, and if you authorize me, I will take the occasion to give a tribute to one of your colleagues, a good friend of Tibet and a very important person inside the IPAC, the Interparliamentarian Alliance on China. I mean, Kimberly Kitching, who died suddenly in March. Kimberly, I think you agree with me, was a very nice, excellent person. She has worked a lot to get this law, on Magnitsky law in Australia. She backed the Tibetan cause for years and years, and she was very active in our Interparliamentarians Alliance on China. So I take profit to give her tribute because...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, because she did. She really drove that dogged determination and never giving up.
Yeah, it was someone very wonderful, and it is a great loss. So I give the floor now to Uldis Budrikis. Sorry for, I'm not sure this is a good pronunciation. You parliamentarian of Latvia. It's an interesting country because it is a rather new democracy renewed democracy, and living with a ferocious neighbor. I mean the Federation of Russia and also Belarus. So your point of view is very interesting for us. So the floor is yours. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. In the morning, I had a prepared speech after the morning session. I switched to notes, and after Janet's speech, I will speak from the heart. So, yeah. You know, it's a pleasure to be here. You're completely right that we have a ferocious neighbor. We already keep the border between the Russian Federation and Belarus as one whole, because in a complete sense, the country of Belarus doesn't exist anymore. It's part of Russia. But it's a pleasure to be here on the 8th Convention on Tibet. The 7th one was in Riga, Latvia, and we had the pleasure to meet you, most of you guys, and I'm very happy to see those faces who were in Latvia, and many more faces which I see here. And that just means that these issues on Tibet, even though the 7th Convention was in May 2019, a few years has passed. There has been a pandemic all over the world, and still these issues are on the table, and I'm very happy that new people are joining us. So, and if we see that, at least in the Baltic states, I see after the 24th of February when Russia did these things, like ferocious things, and started a war in Ukraine, I see that at least in the Baltics and the Scandinavians, that a lot of parliamentarians are coming together with people who are like-minded, and I see that it's like a change in perspective, because we try to help and form bonds together with like-minded people, and I see that at least in my parliament after the 24th of February, there's a lot more friends for Tibet, for Taiwan, and a lot of more concurrence against like those regimes, as I called Russia, Belarus, and China. So I had a question today. Why is Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia so vocal after the 24th concerning issues against tyranny and against dictatorship and against like crimes that are happening in Ukraine and all over the world? I would say it's just as you mentioned. Latvia went through, and the Baltic states went through 50 years of occupation from the USSR, and after having these struggles day by day, like after living day by day with fear, after living day by day of oppression, there came the day when we could call ourselves an independent country. And I see that there's a lot of the democratic peoples who are striving for the same cause as Tibetans, as we saw it in the movie. And what can I say? Like in practical terms, as I see it, even though in Europe right now we in all kind of interparliamentary assemblies, there are good words and strivings for peace and everything, but we see that there has been a real struggle to convince a lot of parliamentarians, a lot of countries, that there is oppression. And we have been vocal against tyranny. Just to say, like, few examples, starting from 2008, when Russia occupied territories in Georgia. Then there was the occupation of Crimea in 2014. All these things were like the Baltics were vocal on these issues in the international international organizations. And you know, I saw a book there. There was the title "Willingly Blind," and basically a lot of countries were willingly blind to see these ferocious actions, what are happening there. And now we see, after years and years, that we were basically screaming, like, "This is bad. Let's do something about it." And we see that what's the end result? The end result is a full-blown war after the 24th of February in Ukraine. And I hope that after these meetings, at least we can be more active and like persuade our fellow colleagues in other countries, and because all of the parliamentarians are in some kind of international organizations. I hope that we can like be more vocal and convince our fellow parliamentarians that there is an issue, that we need to do something about it. We have practical things which we can do, and I hope it will be for the better. So as we did day by day, we strive for the better, strive for democracy, and day by day, and step by step, I hope that Tibet will be free as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldis. I must say, as a European, as a French member, we are very, very proud and admirative of what Baltic countries do today, and the reaction you have, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, in front of Russia, but also in front of China. And you can be considered as small European country, but in the heart you are very large and very big, and we are very proud of you. Thank you so much. So now I give the floor to Arif Virani. He is a Canadian parliamentarian, and so the floor is yours.
Beaucoup, Monsieur le Sénateur. Donc, je vous souhaite la bienvenue, c'est gentil. Yo hablo poquito español, me solamente poquito, but I will start by saying Tashidlek in Gadinche. Thank you for having me on this panel today. It's always auspicious to share a panel with Sikyong, but to also be accompanied by the Senator, see Mr. Budrikis and Senator Rice. It's quite daunting because we all bring our different perspectives, and they're very rich perspectives. The Canadian delegation here is strong, so I'm going to start by mentioning James Maloney is also here, Butila Karpoche is here, Senator Danino, who's being mentioned again, who has been here 7 times in a row now, 8 times in a row. But Canada is very committed to this, and with a lot of just cause. Let me also say that what we are doing with respect to Tibet and the Tibetan cause is informed by a lot of what we've just seen. And I want to start with that video because I fancy myself, after about 7 or 8 years doing this, to know a lot about the CTA, to have learned a lot from Pempa Seringla, the man next to me, also his predecessor Lobsang Sangye, and so many other Tibetan delegations that have come to the House of Commons in Ottawa. But what I've seen in that video is really the genesis of democracy for the people of Tibet. And yet another example, and I shouldn't be surprised, but yet another example of His Holiness's vision and leadership. It is interesting because for those of you who are political science junkies who may have studied it, as I did some 30 years ago, you know about people, there are times when people fight for democracy, and sometimes when people are sort of bestowed democracy. And here it was almost seemed to be a bit of a fight to hold on to His Holiness's political power for as long as possible. But being the incredibly sage individual that he is, as Mr. Gear described this morning, he had a sense of where the Tibetan diaspora and the Tibetan people needed to go, and he also had the humility to lead them there. And I think what you saw in that video was very illuminating for me, but also in its genesis of how the different institutions evolved to what you now have as, ripe elections for members of parliament. It was nice to see them in the video, but also for entities like the Sikyong. And I've seen fellows like the man next to me campaigning in my riding of Parkdale High Park. Let me pause parenthetically and to say to you, what is your connection? What is this guy named Arif Virani doing, talking about Tibet in the middle of a conference in Washington, D.C.? So the connection is through my constituents. I represent about, James and I fight, but I think I represent about 7,000, maybe 5,000 to 7,000 Tibetan Canadians in Parkdale High Park. You can Google, if you Google map Little Tibet, Toronto, you will see my riding. So please feel free to get on your phones if you like. But it is more than that, because what I also feel connected with is the basic struggle for human rights. I practiced law as a human rights and constitutional lawyer for 15 years before getting elected. And I also feel a strong affinity for the route that Tibetans have taken, particularly Tibetans who have come to Canada, because that route usually comes via Nepal or India. My ancestry is via India to East Africa, then to Canada. So, and I've spent time in India. I still have relatives in India. I've worked and lived in India. So I can speak to my Tibetan constituents in languages they appreciate and understand, but I see very much their struggle as part of a broader Asian struggle via South Asia. So that is my own sort of skin in the game. But I think what we are doing and what we are seeing is some of the themes that resonate with what some of the co-panelists have just mentioned. And the first that I wanted to mention is just that this idea about the agency that I think Senator Rice talked about. And I think if there's a lesson that I'll take from Richard Gere, Nancy Pelosi, and Jim McGovern this morning, is that the agency is not just about bestowing democracy to individual Tibetans in the diaspora or in the TAR, but it's about what we do with our agency and how hard we work, because we need more McGoverns and we need more people like the passing of your late colleague in terms of putting our foot to the floor, or in terms of ensuring that we work hard on this. But I also see, in terms of what MP Budrikes was mentioning, and Paldiez, thank you for your submissions, is this idea that multilateralism is pivotal. And Canada is not just home to, my riding is not just home to a large Tibetan diaspora, it is home to a large Ukrainian diaspora. Canada is the home to many communities from around the planet, as you probably are well aware. But what we see with Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a couple of things. We see, one, how precious democracy is. We see, two, that it takes guts to speak up against authoritarianism. And I'm very proud that so many of the nations that are in this room, so many of the nations on this panel have spoken, along with Canada, about the unlawful, unjust, and completely absurd aggression that is Russian aggression. But I think it's critical that we speak out about that, not just for European stability of France and Latvia and other countries like the Balts, but it's for global stability. Because if we know anything about the Chinese, we know that they are watching closely how the world reacts to Putin and his aggression in Ukraine. And if the world is not unified in demonstrating how precious democracy is and how we will stand up for it, then the democracy that tenuously holds in places like Taiwan, the democracy that is slipping in places like Hong Kong, is that much more vulnerable. And what Xi can do in places like China itself, vis-a-vis Uyghurs, vis-a-vis the Tibetan Autonomous Region, is that he will be emboldened. And we owe it to ourselves, as well as to our Tibetan colleagues, to not allow him to be emboldened. So I would just reiterate that multilateralism is key. And I'll give you a fine Canadian example of multilateralism, that after Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were completely, ridiculously, and unjustly detained by the CCP, we started a movement for a convention against arbitrary detention. That convention doesn't get anywhere unless other nations that are like-minded sign on. So what we need is more of that signing on, more of that buying in, because that multilateralism is what you heard about this morning, and that multilateralism is key to fighting for this democracy. But I'd also inject another component, and that is the democracy through youth. And I'm going to connect this to both what Senator Rice started with, but also with what Sikyong La had mentioned. So Senator Rice, thank you for making that acknowledgement. We do similar acknowledgements in Canada. So my riding is the home to the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Mississaugas of the Credit, for example. But when you connect Indigenous fights for basic independence and autonomy and control, and you connect it to what's happening with colonized people like Tibetans, I think the comparison is rife, because what Sikyong La has just mentioned earlier, what I've heard about, is about these schools where children are being actively taken from their homes, put into these schools, call them what you want, a colonial school, administrative schools. In Canada, we call them residential schools. And we have a very painful past about relating to this issue. In Canada, the slogan, going back 130, 150 years, was, let's take the Indian out of the child, the Indian being the Indigenous identity. And children were forced to give up their identity, change their language, change their behaviors in an effort to assimilate into white European Canadian society. It's a completely horrific part of our past, and not too distant past, because the last one was closed in 1995. But when I hear the Sikyong talk about these schools and what I've learned about them are happening right now in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, it sounds to me like colonial residential schools. It sounds to me like forced assimilation all over again. So that Indigenous connection is rife, it is real, and it is serious, and it must be countered, because we can object to the failures of countries like Canada or Australia in the past or not too distant past, but to know that this is happening right now is something that should be appalling to all of us, and that kind of assimilation cannot be countenanced. What I wanted to say is a little bit about what we've done in Canada and finish on what I think we need to do in terms of burgeoning this fight for democratic rights for Tibetans within Canada, but Tibetans in the diaspora, obviously. In Canada, people like James and I, and members of the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet, we've been doing good work with youth in particular. And let me just come back to the youth idea. We've done great work with something called a Tibetan Youth Internship Program in Canada. And one of the first conversations I had with Sikyong in his new role was about how do you export Canada's internship program to many other parliaments around the world, be it El Salvador or Latvia or anywhere in between. And this, our friendship group is in its 32nd year, from 1990, and our internship group program is in its 11th year. And right now, as we speak, James and I both have interns in our offices. They're probably watching right now on live stream. But they do terrific work. And it's not just that they come to learn in Ottawa, but they come to teach us. And they teach us about Lacquer Wednesdays. They teach us about the Middle Way. They teach us about the Sino-Tibetan dialogue. They teach us about the whereabouts of the Panchen Lama. And through them, we learn, but also through the experience they get, they become leaders for the cause. And they've gone on to be things like assistants to ministers. One is working with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. One runs the Canada-Tibet Committee in Canada. So they've gone on to great positions. And it's a real fertile ground for leadership. So that's how we're building democracy on the ground in Canada. I think we can do a lot more. We've been successful in securing things like funding for Tibetan education of youth in places like India and Nepal. We've been successful in sort of raising the discussion about His Holiness, about people like the Karmapa whom we've welcomed, about things like such as immigration irritants, about getting Tibetans into Canada who might not have had accurate or proper travel documentation coming out of India or Nepal. But there's so much more to do. And I'll end in terms of what Sikyong has asked me, and also in my one meeting with His Holiness, what he asked me. And what Sikyong asked me to do is keep up the fight for the Tibetan cause, try and promote this youth internship and take it internationally. He's also asked us to work on things like more parliamentary resolutions and doing it efficaciously in a multi-partisan manner. But in the meeting, and those all make eminent sense, and I've committed that we will work on all of those. But in my one meeting with His Holiness, and it was quite a meeting, it's one that will stay with me likely to the end of my days, because he was so friendly, kind of like an old grandfather. He was holding my hand, he was laughing. He was wondering who is this brown-skinned Canadian guy who speaks great Tibetan, because I threw about four sentences at him. But when I asked His Holiness, I said, Your Holiness, let's say the Chinese were willing to invite me or James or other federal parliamentarians. I think they're just going to put up a dog and pony show and it will just be all a farce. So what's the point in actually going? And he paused, and he grabbed my hand, and he said, you should go. You should go because it is important for you to see my people with your own eyes, and it is also important for my people to see you with their eyes. And even if they cannot articulate in words the abuse or the oppression they are facing, they will be able to communicate it to you through their eyes. And they will know by your presence that the world has not forgotten Tibet. And much like everyone's encounters with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that message has stuck with me. That message is something that I am trying to stay true to. It is becoming more and more difficult as we get more and more vocal in Canada about Chinese human rights abuses. What has gone from, oh, you should come, we'll show you things, has turned to outright aggression. When we announced $5 million in funding, for example, the Chinese representatives at the consulate in Toronto had the audacity to suggest that we shouldn't actually announce that money. We shouldn't actually go to a meeting with the Sikyong. We shouldn't go to a Tibetan cultural event. That's kind of ridiculous on its face, and we told them as much, but that's the level of discussion that happens in diplomatic channels with the Chinese right now. So I'll remain optimistic. I will remain to try and be true to those words that His Holiness shared with me, because the cause is much more important. And I think that's what all of us share here. And I think that's what all of us in this room share here, is that the cause is much more important than a particular irritant with a particular diplomatic agent, because democracy is too fragile internationally, and the rights, linguistic, cultural, and religious freedoms of the Tibetan people are much too valuable for any of us to overlook. So thank you for having me here today to share some of these thoughts. Merci beaucoup. Tujiche Tashile.
Thank you so much, Arif. I appreciate your speech, but we are very late now on the schedule. So, if Sikyong Pampatsering want to say some words to conclude this first session, this first roundtable.
schools that we touched, because when you point that out to the Chinese point fingers at the United States and say, how did you treat your native people? Then they point fingers at the Canadians and say, how did you treat your First Nation people? Then they point fingers at Australia and say, how did you treat your Aboriginal people? So they know what the Americans did at that time, those days, what the Canadians did those days, what the Australians did those days was wrong. And they're doing the same thing to the Tibetans today. And when Janet opened her statement with respecting the native people here, just outside DC, in the same place where we are holding our conference, I know for a fact that in Australia, before you start any event, you invite one native Aborigine to pray for the success of the conference or gathering or whatsoever. So you have the Americans learned their mistakes. They are making up for it. They are trying to reconcile to the grievances that the Native and the Aborigines and the First Nation people have. The Canadians are also doing the same. The Australians are also doing the same. But the Chinese are doing exactly the opposite. They know it's wrong, but they are doing it, and they are trying to justify that by telling the telling others what you did earlier in your history. So that apart, and then I also wanted to point out that the reason why we had this conference in Washington, D.C. is also because the United States is the only country that has a law on Tibet. So the Congress has, the State Department and the White House, the administration has to report to the Congress on progresses, whether it's on negotiation or human rights situations inside Tibet. And that is what keeps it going. And coming back to this topic of democracy, I know there are many people who suffer like us. There are many communities who are outside their countries, struggling for freedom. But unlike others, we had a leader. I remember some of our Uyghur friends who used to tell us that we have the body but no head. You have head but no body. So they're of course, talking about His Holiness, the leadership of His Holiness Dalai Lama. And our Uyghur friends have also learned from us. They have elected leadership in the form of Dolkun Isa, and they also have now they call themselves the government in exile, Uyghur government in exile. So we will be, I even tell our Hong Konger friends that you are young, energetic, educated. There are many things that you can do, but as we Tibetans say, hope for the best. And prepare for the worst. Our generation, my parents' generation, also thought that we will be returning back to Tibet in 2-3 years' time. But we had to live in exile for the last 60 years, and we are facing the same opponent. Even Hong Kongers will have to learn to prepare for the worst. If there are any ways that we can help them, we'll be very happy to do that. I attended World Uyghur Congress many years back, and I also told them the same. If there is anything that we can teach you through our experience with the long-term vision of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we'll be happy to do that. But then certain circumstances doesn't allow all of us to meet in the place where we are located. But our cooperation continue to grow, and tomorrow we will witness what concrete proposals come out of the discussion on facing common challenges. Then with governments, we all know when we talk about advocacy, when we talk about creating law on Tibet, it's not easy. You are in different situations. There are different political systems. You have different internal domestic issues that you need to take care of. We know also I always keep telling the Tibetans that for every nation, of course, we have to try to reach out to the international community as much as possible. But for every nation, their interest comes first. They want set aside their national interests for the cause of Tibet. That is also a reality. But we have had very good support from the US government, and this morning also we talked about some of our, I think Richard Gere also raised about the level of the special coordinator's post. We had discussions as to whether this should be an assistant secretary's post or undersecretary's post. But with the assistant secretary post, even if that person is designated only for special these Tibet issues, if China does not recognize that person or the position, there are not many avenues for that person to raise the concerns of the Tibetan struggle. When it goes up to the undersecretary's position, then there are many areas that that person will have to deal with China at many levels. So they just can't ignore. That is the reason why we appreciated the Biden administration for taking it back to the undersecretary's level. And the undersecretary, Azra Zeya, has been very, very proactive in our approach in the last few months since she took over as the special coordinator's position. When we were here in April, she met us very willingly. Just soon after she took over, her first engagement was to talk with our representative here in Washington, D.C. Then she also engaged with Tibet Fund. She answered to all the calls from the Tibetan media. And, after our visit here, she came to Dharamsala, met with His Holiness, and had a good understanding of the situation of the Central Tibetan Administration, and to follow up on all the economic or programmatic engagements that we have with them already. And then she also undertook a visit to Nepal to address the challenges that our people face in Nepal in terms of registration of Nepalese, and hopefully things will turn for the better in the next few months to come. And now, lastly, I just want to say that in the last 60 years, it has been the effort of one and only His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now it's incumbent on the political leader and the leaders within the Tibetan community to carry this movement forward. And that makes it more challenging for us. And we are only about 130,000 Tibetans in exile. So we need your consistent support till the Sino-Tibet conflict is resolved in a peaceful, mutually beneficial, lasting solution. Therefore, your continued support is very important. I became emotional in the morning because I have studied Tibet support movement for many years, and people like the Speaker Nancy Pelosi has been there for the last 35 years, and Jim Magum also talked about Tibet not being treated as a flavor of the month kind of issue that is taken up only once in a while, and once that flavor is gone, then the issue is also forgotten. So I urge you to be consistent with your support, whether there are other pressing issues or not. Of course, we are very much shoulder to shoulder with our Uyghur friends, shoulder to shoulder with our Southern Mongolian friends. But unfortunately, in Southern Mongolia today, it's only about 15 to 16% Mongolians, and the rest are all Turks and Chinese. Now, in Manchuria, there are hardly any Manchurians who speak Manchukuo language today, even though there are a different nationality within China. So therefore, we don't want to see Tibet to be turned into another Manchuria, or Tibet to be turned into another Southern Mongolia. So your support is very, very essential, and all the more essential now that His Holiness is not able to travel. But I want to assure you, and His Holiness is also committed to live long. So that is why he keeps saying that now I will travel less, I will eat well, I'll sleep well in Dharamsala, and then I will live longer. And then I sometimes challenge our Chinese friends, saying, let us see whether the Communist Party outlives the Dalai Lama or the Dalai Lama outlives the Communist Party. So I'm positive that His Holiness the Dalai Lama will outlive the Communist Party, and there will be freedom for the Tibetan people, for the Uyghur people, for the Mongolians and others. Thank you very much for all your support, and we really look forward to working with you. And we have a lot of plans to travel. Our parliamentarians will also travel to different countries. We will also, our Minister for the Department of Information and International Relations is also here. She will also travel. I will also travel. First, mostly to those countries with whom we already have good relations, and then we want to extend beyond that. I'm very happy that there is a huge delegation from South America. There is already an invitation from Yanis to come to the Baltic states. We need to discuss more about this. We have a lot of plans to travel, and we really look forward for all of you also to come to Dharamsala. There is always an open invitation for you to come to Dharamsala and to witness our administration there. So thank you very much again for all your support. Thank you.
Before beginning the very short and quick tea time, tea break, we have some practical announcement to you.
So first of all, I want to thank the chair and the distinguished panelists on the session, Democracy, Relevance and Challenges in Today's World. We are going to make a slight change to the schedule. We are going to have tea break from now till 5 o'clock. And the next session will begin at 5 o'clock sharp. I also have a couple quick housekeeping announcements to make. The first one is the members of the drafting committee are being asked to meet outside next to the Sheraton link, the drafting committee members. I hope folks know who they are. And the second announcement is for tonight's dinner that is being hosted by the International Campaign for Tibet. They're also hosting a cocktail hour right after this meeting, starting at 6 o'clock. So we want to express our gratitude to ICT. Thanks a lot, and please join us for the tea break.